The November morning was crisp and clear as Sarah Mitchell's black Mercedes S-Class pulled up to Kennedy International Airport's private aviation terminal. The driver, Thomas, who had worked for her company for the past 5 years, quickly stepped out to open her door. Sarah emerged from the car looking elegantly casual in her navy blazer, white silk blouse, and tailored black pants, her typical Friday business attire. At 38 years old, Sarah had mastered the art of comfortable yet professional travel wear, something she learned over years of building Mitchell Aviation into one of the country's most successful private airline companies. Her natural hair was styled in neat box braids, pulled back into a professional bun, and her minimal makeup highlighted her warm brown eyes and high cheekbones. "Will you be needing anything else, Ms. Mitchell?" Thomas asked, removing her leather weekend bag from the trunk. "No, thank you, Thomas. Remember, take the rest of the day off. It's your daughter's recital tonight, isn't it?" Sarah smiled, adjusting the strap of her laptop bag on her shoulder. Thomas's face lit up. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for remembering." As Thomas drove away, Sarah checked her watch, 10:15 a.m. Her flight to Atlanta was scheduled for 11 o'clock a.m., giving her plenty of time to review some documents before takeoff. After a week of intense meetings with potential investors in New York, she was looking forward to getting home to her own bed. The private aviation terminal stood separate from the main airport buildings, its glass and steel structure gleaming in the morning sun. Sarah had personally overseen its renovation 2 years ago, transforming it into a modern facility that served not only Mitchell Aviation's fleet, but other private carriers as well. Walking toward the entrance, Sarah noticed several other passengers being processed through security, mostly middle-aged white men in business suits, the typical clientele in private aviation. A few were familiar faces, executives who regularly chartered Mitchell Aviation's jets. She made mental notes to greet them inside, always the conscious businesswoman building relationships. Her phone buzzed with a text from her chief of operations, Marcus. "Planes ready. New crew today, but they're our best. Safe flight, boss." Sarah smiled, typing back a quick thanks. She worked hard to build a company culture where everyone from the ground crew to the executive team felt valued and essential. It hadn't been easy, especially as a black woman in an industry dominated by white men, but she'd done it through determination, excellence, and an unwavering vision. As she approached the terminal's glass doors, Sarah could see her reflection. Confident, poised, and every bit the CEO she worked so hard to become. The weight of her success sat comfortably on her shoulders now, though she never took it for granted. Each day still brought its own challenges and, occasionally, its own reminders of the prejudices that persisted, even in 2024. Inside the terminal, the familiar sounds of muted conversations and rolling luggage filled the air. The space was designed to be welcoming yet efficient, with comfortable seating areas, a coffee bar, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runways. Several of Mitchell Aviation's jets were visible on the tarmac, their distinctive dark blue and silver livery gleaming under the morning sun. Sarah checked her phone again, this time pulling up the flight manifest. It was a habit she'd developed early in her career, knowing every detail of her operations. The crew assigned to her flight today was indeed new, but they came highly recommended from her training department. She looked forward to meeting them. The sound of a throat clearing caught her attention. Sarah looked up to see an unfamiliar security guard standing at his post near the security checkpoint. He was middle-aged, white, with graying hair at his temples and a stern expression that seemed fixed on her. His name tag read Peterson. Something in his stance and the way his eyes narrowed made Sarah's stomach tighten slightly. After 15 years in the aviation industry, she developed a sixth sense for these situations. Her grip unconsciously tightened on her designer laptop bag, which held all her identification and company credentials. As she walked toward the security checkpoint, Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, reminding herself that she handled far worse situations in building her company from the ground up. What she didn't know was that the next few minutes would test her patience, professionalism, and principles in ways she hadn't experienced in years. As Sarah approached the security checkpoint, Guard Peterson stepped directly into her path, his hand raised in a stopping motion. His face hardened as she came closer, and he planted his feet firmly, making his intention to block her path clear. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a note of authority that seemed excessive for the situation. This is a private aviation terminal. The main passenger terminal is in the other building. He gestured vaguely toward the direction of the regular airport terminal, not even attempting to hide his dismissive tone. Sarah kept her expression neutral, having dealt with similar situations throughout her career. She reached for her identification in her laptop bag. Actually, I'm in the right place. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I'm here for my flight. Peterson's face twisted into a skeptical smirk. Right. And I'm the President of the United States. He chuckled, looking over her shoulder at some of the other guards who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. Ma'am, this terminal is for private jet passengers only. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Behind them, several white executives walked through the security checkpoint without even being asked to show their IDs. One of them, Richard Thompson from a competing charter company, recognized Sarah and started to wave, but she gave him a subtle head shake. She wanted to handle this situation her way. Sir, Sarah said calmly, finally pulling out her ID and company credentials, if you'll just look at these. Peterson cut her off, refusing to even glance at the documents she was holding. Listen, I don't know how you got in here, but we have strict protocols. This area is for authorized personnel and private jet passengers only. His voice grew louder, drawing attention from others in the terminal. Sarah noticed her lead flight attendant, Jessica, watching from near the coffee bar, clearly concerned. Several other employees had also noticed the confrontation, but Sarah gave them a subtle signal to stay back. She'd faced discrimination before, and she knew the importance of handling such situations with dignity and purpose. Mr. Peterson, Sarah tried again, reading his name tag. I understand you're doing your job, but I am exactly where I need to be. If you'll just look at my credentials. Ma'am. Peterson interrupted again, his hand moving to his radio. I've been working security for 20 years. I know when someone doesn't belong, and you don't belong here. Now, you can either leave on your own, or I can call airport police to escort you out. The tension in the terminal was palpable now. Other passengers had stopped to watch, some recording with their phones, others whispering among themselves. Sarah could hear fragments of their conversations. Is that Sarah Mitchell? Someone should do something. Isn't she the owner? Sarah straightened her spine, standing her full height. She built her company facing exactly this kind of prejudice, and while it was infuriating that it still existed, she knew how to handle it. Mr. Peterson, before you make that call, I suggest you. That's it. Peterson reached for his radio, pressing the talk button. Security to main desk, I need backup at the private terminal checkpoint. We have an unauthorized person refusing to leave the premises. Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression composed despite the humiliation of the situation. She could see her chief of operations, Marcus, rushing through the terminal doors behind Peterson, his face a mix of concern and anger. Several other Mitchell Aviation employees were moving closer, ready to intervene. Just then, the terminal supervisor's voice crackled through Peterson's radio. Peterson, hold your position. I'm coming out. Peterson smiled smugly at Sarah, clearly expecting the supervisor to support his actions. See, ma'am? This could have been avoided if you just listened to me in the first place. The supervisor will escort you out. Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her dignified stance. The next few moments would be interesting, to say the least. She could already hear the hurried footsteps of the terminal supervisor approaching from behind Peterson, and she knew exactly how this scene was about to change. The look on Peterson's face in the next few seconds would be one that Sarah would remember for a long time to come. The terminal supervisor, Michael Chen, burst through the door behind Peterson, slightly out of breath. His eyes widened in recognition as he saw Sarah standing there, and his face immediately paled. Miss Mitchell, I am so sorry about this. He rushed forward, moving past Peterson, who stood frozen in place, his smug expression melting into confusion. Hold all calls for backup. Chen quickly spoke into his radio, then turned to Peterson. James, do you have any idea who you're speaking to? Peterson's confusion deepened as he watched Chen's respectful demeanor toward Sarah. Sir, this woman was trying to access the private terminal without proper. This is Sarah Mitchell. Chen interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration. She's the CEO and owner of Mitchell Aviation. This is her terminal. The color drained from Peterson's face as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Around them, the terminal had gone completely quiet, every eye focused on the unfolding scene. Sarah maintained her composure, though her heart was racing with a mix of familiar emotions: anger, exhaustion, and determination. She built her company facing exactly this kind of prejudice, but having it happen at her own terminal felt particularly pointed. "Mr. Peterson," Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm but firm, "would you like to look at my credentials now?" She held out her ID and company documents, which he took with trembling hands. Several employees had gathered nearby, including Marcus, her chief of operations, who looked ready to intervene. Sarah could hear the whispers and see the phone still recording. This incident would likely be on social media within minutes. Peterson stared at the documents, his face growing increasingly red. The ID clearly showed Sarah's photo and her title: Sarah Mitchell, CEO and founder, Mitchell Aviation. The company credentials included her signature, which was also prominently displayed on the wall behind them, part of the terminal's dedication plaque. I, Peterson stammered, "Ms. Mitchell, I had no idea." Clearly, Sarah interrupted, her voice level but carrying authority that made everyone in the terminal stand a little straighter. "Mr. Peterson, would you like to explain why you felt confident enough to deny me entry without even checking my identification?" The terminal remained silent, waiting for his response. Peterson's face had gone from red to ashen. "I was just following security protocols." His voice trailed off weakly. "Were you?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the other passengers who had walked through during their confrontation. "Because I noticed several people passing through without showing any ID at all. What made me different from them?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Everyone knew exactly what made Sarah different, and Peterson's actions had laid bare the ugly prejudice that still existed, even in 2024. Chen stepped forward. "Ms. Mitchell, I assure you this will be dealt with immediately. Mr. Peterson, please report to my office." He turned to Sarah again. "Your flight crew is ready, and I'll personally escort you to your aircraft." But Sarah held up her hand, stopping both men. "Actually, Mr. Chen, I'd like to handle this situation differently." She turned to face Peterson directly. "You're new here, aren't you?" Peterson nodded slowly. 3 weeks, ma'am." "Then this is an opportunity," Sarah said, her voice taking on a different tone, one she often used when turning challenges into teaching moments. "Mr. Peterson, would you join me in Mr. Chen's office? I think we need to have a conversation about assumptions, protocols, and the future of security in this terminal." The gathered crowd began to disperse, though many continued to watch discreetly. Marcus approached Sarah, concern evident on his face. "Do you want me to delay the flight?" Sarah checked her watch and nodded. "Push it back an hour. This conversation needs to happen now." She turned back to Peterson, who stood rigid with embarrassment and fear. "Shall we, Mr. Peterson? I believe we both have some things to learn from this situation." As Sarah led the way to the supervisor's office, she could feel the weight of what was about to happen. This wasn't just about one security guard or one incident. It was about addressing a deeper problem that still plagued her industry and society at large. Inside the terminal supervisor's office, Sarah sat behind Chen's desk, having declined his offer to sit in the visitor's chair. Peterson stood awkwardly by the door while Chen leaned against the wall, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "Please sit, Mr. Peterson." Sarah gestured to the chair across from her. Her voice was neither angry nor friendly. It carried the measured tone of someone used to handling difficult situations. Peterson lowered himself into the chair, his security badge glinting under the office lights. "Do you know how I started Mitchell Aviation?" Sarah asked, surprising both men with her question. When Peterson shook his head, she continued, "I started as a flight attendant 20 years ago. Back then, there were even fewer people who looked like me in aviation." She paused, studying Peterson's face. He was sweating slightly, his collar damp around the edges. "During my first year, a passenger refused to let me serve him. He said he didn't trust my kind with his drink." Sarah's words made Peterson flinch. "The flight captain that day didn't defend me. Instead, he apologized to the passenger." Chen shifted uncomfortably against the wall, but Sarah continued, "That moment changed my life. I realized that waiting for others to change the system wouldn't work. I needed to become the system. She opened her laptop, typing briefly before turning the screen toward Peterson. This is Mitchell Aviation's first plane. I bought it used, with every penny I had saved in loans from 12 different banks, most of whom initially refused to even meet with me. Peterson leaned forward slightly, looking at the image of a small, worn business jet with faded paint. It doesn't look like much, he admitted quietly. No, it didn't, Sarah agreed. But it was everything to me. I flew as the flight attendant on that plane while learning to run a business at night. Many passengers assumed I was just the help, not the owner. Some, like you today, tried to stop me from boarding my own aircraft. The shame on Peterson's face deepened. Miss Mitchell, I really am sorry. I didn't. Sarah held up her hand, stopping him. Mr. Peterson, what I want to know is why. Why didn't you simply check my credentials when I offered them? Why did you assume I didn't belong here? The room fell silent. Peterson stared at his hands, then finally looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. I made assumptions, wrong ones. Based on... He trailed off. Based on what I look like, Sarah finished for him. The color of my skin. Peterson nodded, unable to maintain eye contact. Here's what's interesting, Sarah continued, pulling up another document on her laptop. In the 3 weeks you've worked here, you've stopped and questioned 43 passengers. 41 of them were people of color. She turned the screen toward him, showing the security checkpoint data. Peterson's face showed genuine shock. I didn't. I never realized. Most people don't realize their biases, Sarah said, her tone softening slightly. That's why they're called unconscious bias. But in your position, these biases don't just hurt feelings. They can destroy opportunities, perpetuate stereotypes, and in some cases, even threaten lives. Chen stepped forward. Ms. Mitchell, I can assure you that Mr. Peterson's employment will be terminated immediately. But Sarah shook her head. No, that's not the solution I want. She looked directly at Peterson. Firing you would be easy, but it wouldn't solve the larger problem. Instead, I have a different proposition. She stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the terminal where her employees were going about their duties. Mitchell Aviation is about to launch a new training program focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion in private aviation. Mr. Peterson, I want you to be part of our first training group. Peterson looked up, surprise evident on his face. You're not firing me. No, Sarah replied, turning back to face him. Instead, I'm going to show you exactly why your actions today were not just wrong, but dangerous to everything we're trying to build in this industry. That is, if you're willing to learn. The silence that followed was heavy with significance. In that moment, both Sarah and Peterson knew that what happened next would depend entirely on his response, and potentially change both their lives in unexpected ways. Peterson sat up straighter in his chair, his face showing a mix of relief and uncertainty. I want to learn, he said, his voice carrying more conviction than it had moments before. I never thought of myself as prejudiced, but today made me realize I have a lot to understand. Sarah nodded, then pressed a button on the office phone. Marcus, could you join us, please? Within moments, her chief of operations entered the office, carrying a tablet and looking questioningly at the group. Marcus, Sarah began, I want you to share your first day story with Mr. Peterson. Marcus, a tall black man in his early 40s dressed in an impeccable suit, pulled up another chair. My first day as chief of operations? He asked, though he knew exactly which story Sarah meant. Yes, Sarah confirmed, watching Peterson's face carefully. Marcus turned to Peterson, his expression serious. 3 years ago, on my first day, I was wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, had my new ID badge prominently displayed, was carrying a briefcase with our company logo. And you know what happened? Peterson shook his head slowly. Security stopped me, made me wait for an hour while they verified my credentials, called my references, asked me to prove I wasn't stealing someone's identity. Marcus's voice remained calm, but his eyes carried the weight of the memory. That was after Ms. Mitchell had personally announced my hiring to the entire company. Peterson's face fell further. That's terrible. That's reality, Sarah interjected. For many of our employees, for our passengers of color, for me. She stood up and walked to a large photo on the wall showing her company's first all-female, all-minority flight crew. Do you know what happened the day this crew flew? Both Chen and Peterson shook their heads. 3 different airports questioned their credentials. 2 passengers demanded different pilots. 1 fuel company refused to service the aircraft until they spoke to the real person in charge. Sarah turned back to the group. That was just last year. Marcus opened his tablet and pulled up some statistics. In private aviation, less than 3% of pilots are black. Less than 1% of aviation company CEOs are black women. But at Mitchell Aviation, we'd increased our minority employment by 400% in the last 5 years. We've created scholarship programs, training initiatives, and mentorship opportunities. Sarah returned to her seat. And then, Mr. Peterson, we have days like today. We're right in our own terminal. The very prejudice we're fighting against shows itself. Peterson looked at the photo on the wall, then back at Sarah. I want to be part of the change, he said quietly. I really do. I never saw it before, never understood. That's why firing you isn't the answer, Sarah explained. Instead, I want you to work with Marcus and our training team. Learn about unconscious bias, understand the impact of snap judgments, then help us train others. Chen, who had been quiet, stepped forward. Ms. Mitchell, this is incredibly generous, but our security protocols need to change, Sarah finished firmly. We need protocols based on actual security concerns, not prejudice disguised as procedure. She turned to Peterson. Are you willing to be part of that change? Peterson sat up straighter. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Good, Sarah said, checking her watch. Because your first training session starts tomorrow. Marcus will oversee your progress personally. She stood, signaling the meeting was ending. Mr. Peterson, I believe in second chances. I believe in learning from mistakes. But make no mistake, this is your one opportunity to be part of the solution. As they all stood, Peterson extended his hand to Sarah. Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. I won't let you down. Sarah shook his hand firmly. See that you don't, because the next generation of pilots, flight attendants, and aviation professionals who look like me are counting on all of us to make this industry better. As Sarah left the office to finally board her delayed flight, she knew this incident would become another chapter in her company's story of change. Sometimes, she reflected, the most powerful lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments. Behind her, Peterson watched her go, the weight of his newfound understanding settling on his shoulders, along with the responsibility to do better. The following morning, Peterson arrived at the terminal an hour early, his uniform pressed and his mind racing with thoughts from the previous day. The terminal felt different now. He noticed details he'd overlooked before, like the diverse faces in the company photographs lining the walls and the multiple languages on the safety signs. Marcus was waiting for him in the training room, along with 5 other security officers who had been selected for the first diversity training session. On the screen at the front of the room was the Mitchell Aviation logo, with Sarah's signature quote beneath it. Excellence knows no color. Yesterday, Marcus began, looking directly at Peterson. We had an incident that perfectly illustrates why we're here. Peterson felt the other officer's eyes turn to him, but Marcus continued, and today, we're going to learn from it. The door opened, and to everyone's surprise, Sarah Mitchell walked in. She wasn't supposed to be back from Atlanta until next week, but here she was, carrying a stack of folders. The room immediately stood at attention. Please, sit, she said, placing the folders on the table. What happens in this room today is too important for formality. She opened one of the folders and pulled out several photographs. These are all Mitchell Aviation employees. Every single one of them has a story about being questioned, stopped, or harassed in their own workplace. She laid the photos out one by one: pilots, mechanics, flight attendants, executives. All people of color, all wearing their company uniforms or badges. Mr. Peterson, she said, would you share with the group what you learned yesterday? Peterson stood slowly, his hands slightly shaking. I learned that I was seeing what I expected to see, not what was actually there. He began. I stopped Ms. Mitchell because she didn't fit my image of a private aviation CEO. I didn't even check her ID because I was so sure I was right. Sarah nodded encouragingly, and Peterson continued, growing more confident. I've been in security for 20 years, and yesterday was the first time I really looked at my own actions. I checked our records last night. Out of all the people I've stopped for additional screening, over 90% were minorities. That's not security, that's prejudice. The other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing similar patterns in their own behavior. Marcus pulled up some statistics on the screen, security stop data from private aviation terminals across the country. This isn't just about one incident or one officer, Sarah explained. This is about changing an entire industry's culture. Starting here, starting now. For the next 2 hours, they went through scenarios, watched videos of real incidents, and learned about the concept of unconscious bias. Peterson found himself sharing more details about yesterday's incident, using it as a learning tool for his colleagues. The hardest part, he admitted during one discussion, was realizing that I thought I was just doing my job, but I was actually becoming part of a system that discriminates. Sarah stepped in. That's exactly why this training is so important. It's not about blame, it's about awareness and change. She turned to the group. Each of you will become a trainer yourself, helping to implement these new protocols across all our terminals. As the session continued, Peterson found himself taking extensive notes. He noticed things he never considered before. How body language could be influenced by bias, how certain phrases might carry unintended weight, how quick judgments could escalate situations unnecessarily. Near the end of the session, Sarah handed out new security protocols. These were developed with input from security experts, diversity consultants, and our own employees' experiences, she explained. They focus on actual security threats, not assumptions or biases. Peterson read through the document, noting how it emphasized checking credentials for everyone, using standardized questions, and maintaining professional courtesy regardless of appearance. It was everything he should have done yesterday. Mr. Peterson, Sarah said as the session was ending, would you be willing to lead tomorrow's session, share your experience firsthand? He looked up, surprised but determined. Yes, ma'am. I think my story might help others understand their own biases better. As the room cleared out, Peterson remained behind, studying the photos on the table. Each face represented someone who had faced discrimination similar to what he had shown yesterday. But now, these faces weren't just photos. They were people, professionals, members of the Mitchell aviation family. He'd had a lot to learn, but for the first time, he was truly ready to listen and change. 3 months after the incident, Mitchell Aviation's private terminal had undergone a remarkable transformation. The security team, led by a newly promoted James Peterson as head of diversity and security training, had implemented the new protocols across all of the company's locations. On this particular morning, Sarah stood at the back of the terminal, watching Peterson conduct a training session with new security officers. His voice carried clearly through the room as he shared his story. I almost lost my job because I let my biases control my actions, he was saying to the group. Instead, Ms. Mitchell showed me how to become part of the solution. Today, I'm going to teach you the right way to handle security, with respect, professionalism, and without prejudice. Sarah smiled, remembering how skeptical some board members had been about her decision to promote Peterson rather than fire him, but the results spoke for themselves. Security complaints had dropped by 75% since implementing the new protocols, and customer satisfaction scores had risen significantly. Marcus approached her, holding a tablet with their latest statistics. The industry is starting to notice, he said quietly. 3 other private aviation companies have requested our training program. Sarah nodded, watching as Peterson demonstrated the proper way to check credentials, making sure to treat each role-playing participant with equal respect, regardless of their appearance. Has the video from the incident gone viral again? She asked. Yes, Marcus replied. But this time, people are sharing it alongside videos of our new training program. They're calling it the Mitchell Method, turning bias into breakthrough. The terminal was busier than usual today. A group of young aviation students, all from minority backgrounds, was touring the facility as part of Mitchell Aviation's new mentorship program. Peterson paused his training session to greet them, his face lighting up as he shared his story. Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for change, he told the students. 3 months ago, I was the problem. Today, I'm helping to solve it. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her PR team. The aviation industry's leading magazine wanted to feature Mitchell Aviation's diversity initiative on their cover. The working title was From Confrontation to Transformation: How One Incident Changed Private Aviation. As she typed her response, Sarah overheard Peterson explaining the new security protocols to the students. We check everyone's credentials, every time. No exceptions, no assumptions. We treat everyone with the same level of respect and professionalism. It's not just about security, it's about dignity. One of the students raised her hand. But what if someone important gets annoyed about being checked? Peterson smiled. Then we explained that it's company policy, created by our CEO, who believes that true security doesn't discriminate. Most people respect that, especially when they understand why. Sarah stepped forward, joining the group. The students straightened up, eyes wide with recognition. What Mr. Peterson is teaching goes beyond security, she said. It's about creating an industry where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, regardless of what they look like. She turned to Peterson. How many training sessions have you conducted so far? 37, he answered proudly. And we're scheduled to train security teams at 3 major airports next month. The students listened intently as Sarah continued. Change doesn't always come easily. Sometimes it takes an uncomfortable moment, like what happened 3 months ago, to open our eyes to what needs to change. One of the students, a young black woman, spoke up. Ms. Mitchell, did you ever think about quitting? When people treated you differently? Sarah's expression softened. No, because quitting would have meant letting them win. Instead, I chose to build something better. She gestured around the terminal. This is what better looks like, where security is based on protocols, not prejudice, and where everyone has a chance to learn and grow. As the tour continued, Peterson returned to his training session, and Sarah watched as the terminal hummed with activity. Every security check was conducted professionally, every passenger treated with respect, and every employee worked with a sense of pride. The incident that could have ended in anger and dismissal had instead sparked a movement of change. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the best way to fight prejudice wasn't to punish it, but to transform it into something powerful and positive. 1 year after the incident, Mitchell Aviation hosted its first industry leadership conference on diversity and inclusion in private aviation. The grand ballroom of Atlanta's finest hotel was packed with executives, security personnel, and aviation professionals from around the world. Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium, looking out over the diverse crowd. In the front row sat James Peterson, now the company's global director of security training and inclusion, wearing a confident smile and a Mitchell Aviation pin on his lapel. 1 year ago, Sarah began, an incident in our terminal could have ended very differently. Instead of firing a security guard who showed bias, we chose to transform that moment into a movement. She gestured to Peterson. Would you join me up here, James? Peterson walked to the stage amid applause. The same security guard who had once tried to block Sarah from her own terminal now stood beside her as a respected colleague and champion of change. The Mitchell method, Sarah continued, has now been adopted by 27 private aviation companies worldwide. Our security protocols have been implemented at 42 airports, but numbers don't tell the whole story. She clicked to the next slide, showing photographs of diverse aviation professionals at work. In the past year, minority employment in private aviation has increased by 32%. Customer complaints about discriminatory treatment have decreased by 89%. But most importantly, we're seeing a culture shift. Peterson stepped to the microphone. A year ago, I was part of the problem, he said, his voice carrying strength and humility. Today, I travel around the world teaching others how to be part of the solution. Ms. Mitchell didn't just give me a second chance. She showed me how to give others their first chance. The screen behind them showed clips from their training programs, including security officers of all backgrounds learning and implementing the new protocols. Among the images was a photograph of Peterson stopping a white male passenger for a credential check, following the same respectful procedure now used for everyone. Change is possible, Sarah said, retaking the podium. But it requires more than just new rules. It requires new perspectives, new opportunities, and sometimes new chances for those willing to learn. She unveiled the company's latest initiative, the Mitchell Aviation Scholarship Program, designed to support minority students pursuing careers in aviation. The first recipient was the young black woman who had asked Sarah about quitting during the terminal tour months ago. She now stood up from her seat in the audience, receiving a standing ovation. Today, Sarah announced, Mitchell Aviation isn't just a private airline company. We're a model for what the aviation industry can become, inclusive, fair, and stronger because of our diversity. Peterson presented the company's latest statistics. Employee satisfaction was at an all-time high, safety records had improved, and their training program had a waiting list of companies wanting to implement it. As the conference continued, Sarah watched Peterson leading a breakout session, teaching other security directors the importance of unbiased screening. The man who had once judged her based on her appearance was now teaching others to see beyond their prejudices. During the closing ceremony, Sarah called Peterson back to the stage. Together, they unveiled a new plaque that would hang in every Mitchell aviation terminal. Security through equality, the Mitchell method. 1 year ago, Peterson addressed the crowd. I made a mistake that could have cost me everything. Instead, it taught me everything. Today, I don't just check credentials, I check my assumptions, my biases, and my privilege. Sarah concluded the conference with a final thought. The incident that brought us here today wasn't unique. What makes it special is what we chose to do with it. Instead of letting it divide us, we used it to unite us. Instead of punishment, we chose education. Instead of anger, we chose growth. As the applause filled the room, Sarah and Peterson shared a knowing look. The security guard who had tried to stop a black woman from boarding her own plane was now helping to ensure no one else would face the same discrimination. The story of Mitchell Aviation had become more than just a tale of success. It was a blueprint for change, showing how one moment of confrontation could transform an entire industry. And as Sarah looked out at the diverse faces in the crowd, she knew this was just the beginning. The end.